I'll start with this afternoon's webinar on unintended consequences of public policies. I'll briefly run you through examples. I'll briefly run you through examples which highlight the importance of anticipating unintended consequences, both positive and negative, and addressing them if possible and required. The title is an obvious reference to the overused Shakespeare quote on to be or not to be, but it is perhaps important for us to realize that policies ultimately attempt to change status quo and to change the business as usual scenario. And if the unintended consequences of those policies are not taken into account, we could end up doing more harm than good at times. Also, a quick note on the examples I take. Not an expert in the fields from where I've picked up the examples, so I would request you to focus on the possibility of things going wrong rather than the exact causation in these cases. Let's start with the first one. So in the first half of the 20th century, the US government had this rule of separate but equal in schools, which was really about segregation in schools. This was struck down in the 1990s judgment of the Supreme Court, which said that this wasn't legal and that schools had to be desegregated. A slew of policies followed after this judgment, which aimed to make schools more racially mixed. One such policy was that your child's school would be determined based on your neighborhood. So the intention was that there would be more mixed classrooms as a result. However, this wasn't really the outcome. What instead happened was that the middle class, the white middle class, started moving out of cities into the suburbs. Not that this was the only factor, but this could definitely have been a contributing factor to that. So instead of desegregating schools, the policy might have ended up segregating neighborhoods instead. Let's look at another example. In 1986, the Government of India came out with the Child Labor Prohibition and Regulation Act. The idea here was that child labor for children below the age of 14 was to be banned in order to promote enrollment in school and increase literacy. Instead, what seemed to have happened is in the immediate year following this ban, there was a 12% increase in employed children under the age of 14, 4% relative decrease in their wages, and also children with siblings in the age groups of 10 to 13 were more likely to be pushed into work and out of school by about 5 to 6%. So it seems to have harmed children more than benefited them, at least in the short run. But it's not just about policies failing to meet their objectives because of unintended consequences. Unintended consequences could always be present even when policies are successful on the whole. So I'll take the example that Jay had discussed in the staff meeting of the Indian software industry. The important thing to focus here is on the line which maps exports and the line which maps domestic production in software. This was something that even Jay was alluding to, in that the share of the domestic market has lagged exports quite significantly and the gap seems to be growing. This was almost certainly an unintended consequence of the policy, because if exports are made tax-free, that means there's a higher incentive to export what you're producing rather than produce it for the domestic market. So one shouldn't be surprised if, to some extent, the policy seems to inhibit the growth of the domestic industry. The second thing that can happen, and possibly did happen as a result of this policy, is what is known as the Dutch disease syndrome. This is basically a phenomena by which the growth in one industry seems to reduce the relative competitiveness of other industries. So if exports from the software industry increase, As a result, the value of the rupee appreciates, which means that other industries which are export-oriented in nature find it tougher to compete in the global market because of the increased competitiveness of the Indian economy as a whole. The third possible unintended consequence of this policy might have been that there was a drop in the number of teachers available to teach in IT and computer-related courses because the relative pay in the industry was just way higher than what they would get as teachers. And the fourth possible effect of this policy would have been that it made imports of hardware and software cheaper because there were no import duties on products purchased for use in the software technology parks that were set up, which means that, in effect, the relative competitiveness and purchase of domestic technology and software for these parks would have reduced. So on the whole, we have a policy which was largely successful and yet produced unintended consequences. Some of them could have been addressed, some of them would probably happen regardless, but might still be useful to keep in mind what all can happen. Okay. So we have seen three cases of unintended consequences. In the first two, the unintended consequences seem to have undone the objectives of the policy, while in the third, the policy seems to have been largely successful, but there were still other effects on the economy as a result. But this doesn't mean that unintended consequences would always be negative. As an example, the practice of setting up green spaces and parks that the aristocrats had in medieval Europe has actually contributed to a lot of green spaces in the city. So even though at that time it might not have been an appropriate social action, if you look back at it from today's perspective, it's definitely added something to the city. Similarly, another popular example of a beneficial unintended consequence that's often talked about is the invisible hand metaphor used by Adam Smith, where people following their narrow interests can still lead to socially optimal or socially useful outcomes. So it's this prevalence of unintended consequences which perhaps led Bastiat to remark that there's only one difference between a bad economist and a good one. The bad economist confines himself to the visible effect. The good economist takes into account both the effect that can be seen and those effects that must be foreseen. Bastiat was also incidentally the person who formulated the concept of opportunity cost, so links quite well with his own thinking on anticipating the foreseen. Okay. Time for the audience to come in. Can you think of unintended consequences of a policy in any of the domains in which CSTEP is working? You could probably dial in or raise your hand, and then I could request you to unmute. Would anyone else want to give examples which are more policy-oriented? Shimol?
Hello.
Yeah, Shimol.
Yeah, can you hear?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, can you, hi Nihik, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Since it is of policy and there are plenty of examples in urban planning, in fact any of the urban domain of unintended consequences. One of them is like say we in Karnataka in between do have a policy of creating satellite townships. It started with lot of hype, and at some point policymakers and people thought that is the most necessary steps towards decongesting Bangalore and creating space for the growing urban population. The consequence which is definitely unintended, which later on was realized by people, was that that we are putting a lot of infrastructure which is not finally resulting in the intention of creating new spaces for accommodating urban people, but at the same time we are promoting gated communities and promoting social uninclusiveness and not so equitable development. So that is one example that I'm thinking.
Quite interesting. In fact, I guess in urban, correct me if I'm wrong, but even anticipating urban growth would be very difficult. So I would imagine if one builds a highway for a certain capacity and assumes that there's no development around it, so you wouldn't need intersections, crossroads, and so on. The fact that that highway comes up would probably change the development patterns in the city, leads to more construction around it, then lead to more intersections coming up. What we have seen with the ring road, I guess, and then the airport road.
Yes. Actually, on the airport road, yeah. So one of the examples on that is as well that many times these highways, since they are many times intended to be expressways, so they are barred for the local people from entering the highway. So there has been cases of public litigation such that that it's an infrastructure put in a specific locality, so why should the local people be barred from accessing it? In fact, in some cases, as you were saying, that there were no intersections, essentially to provide for high-speeding cars, so that people had to commute a much longer way to go to a, which is otherwise a very short distance destination for the local life. So this is one of the examples.
That will also have unintended consequences on their time taken to travel, fuel costs.
Exactly, time, and also their right to access a certain infrastructure.
Makes sense. Cool. Thanks, Shinal.
Yeah, thank you.
A couple of other examples that I can think of in the energy domain pertain to one is the domestic content manufacturing requirement in JNMSN. So I'm not implying that if this requirement wasn't there, maybe the development of thin films and crystalline silicon might have been different. But the fact that this requirement is there does place a certain implicit tax on crystalline silicon as opposed to thin films, which probably makes the latter relatively more profitable. And the other is about the accelerated depreciation policy in wind, which really promoted installed capacity rather than generation, and it's still contested whether it did meet the objective. It did lead to higher generation, or did it lead to more inefficient plants with lower PLFs? Okay. Moving on, what could the causes of unintended consequences be? I think from the examples we have seen, they have been very useful in highlighting some of these possible factors which lead to unintended consequences. The list here is from Robert Merton, who was really the one who formalized this concept way back in the 1930s. He talks about lack of adequate knowledge or ignorance as a primary reason for unintended consequences, and also says the unpredictability of human behavior also sort of leads to such things happening. The second he talks about is errors. That could be in how you diagnose the problem. It could be about what you think will get you to a future that you desire. It could be about the action that you select in order to get to that future, or even the execution or implementation of that action. So we're really talking about problem definition, how the alternatives are set up, about how the policy is implemented, and so on. The third he speaks of is short-term interest versus long-term interest. So it's quite possible that people, when they focus on their short-term interest, could end up doing something that you did not anticipate they will do, and as a result end up with a consequence that you did not foresee. So not entirely relevant, but I guess energy efficiency is a domain where we see a lot of short-term interest-based purchases, sort of reducing the scope for both monetary as well as energy efficiency in the sector. The other is the question of values, which is really the one I was finding difficult to nail or pinpoint. But I guess an example I can think of there is equality. So if equality is what is considered as a value, and because of that, if the objective focuses on how to promote equality, there would be unintended consequences that result based on behavior that prescribes to that value, which economists often warn us about. For example, could lead to reduction in risk-taking, could lead to reduced incentives for hard work, could then have spillover effects on innovation, competitiveness of the economy, and so on. And the last one, which would nicely lead me into the next slide, is on self-defeating prophecy. So here he says that the very fact that you have declared something in the public leads people to change their behavior and to adapt to it, and in a sense defeating whatever you said would happen, which then means that your policy might no longer be as relevant as it would have been if people weren't aware of this information that you put out in the public domain in the process of going about a particular policy. So while I found Merton's list very interesting, I felt that it didn't capture some of the newer terminology that we have developed since then in our understanding of systems, whether they are in biology or society or economics, physics, which really is about complexity, adaptive systems, human behavior, how that influences outcomes, chance, randomness, and so on. And an example to illustrate how important even seemingly simple behavior can be is the Schelling's model on segregation, which is the one you see at the bottom of the screen. So the idea that Schelling started with here was that if you see the first block on the left, you start with neighborhoods which are quite mixed, so they're not completely segregated. And individuals here have very simple preferences. All they really want is that they should stay in an area where maybe 3 or 4 people out of 10 are similar to them. And he showed through his analysis that even such a simple preference can actually lead to more segregated neighborhoods over time and end up with the outcome you see in the rightmost box on the slide. So individual behavior, by following simple rules, can really lead to outcomes that you might not imagine at a macro scale. And that's perhaps something we need to keep in mind when we formulate policies which require people to behave in a certain way. So going back to the example we had started with, possibly when the policy on schooling districts was formulated, the thinking might have been that people will largely comply with that policy rather than switching to a private school or even moving homes. But maybe a more realistic assessment of what approach people are likely to take could have informed this policy better and helped it meet its objectives more effectively. So what does this really mean for us? Perhaps as we have seen even through the examples, maybe we really need to think about policy making as an iterative process which, with faster feedback from policy design to program evaluation, to problem definition itself in order to anticipate and reduce undesired side effects or consequences of the policies we formulate. Taking the metaphor further, we probably need to think about practicing policy in the sense that people practice medicine rather than making or analyzing policy. An interesting example of this is how RCTs have picked up in the space of policy making, largely driven by the work of JPAL and associated researchers. So here the idea is to actually do control trials with policy prescriptions to see whether they work, when they work, how they work, and use that to inform policy making on the whole. And with that, I'll end this presentation. Hope you found it interesting. I'd be happy to take any questions you may have. Just raise your hand and I'll probably call out. Shrita?
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, just on the last part that you had in terms of RCTs being used to enable practicing policy or testing it before the full implementation in some sense. My question is that wouldn't that itself, like, is there a need to be a little cognizant of the fact that that itself could have unintended consequences? Because I think a lot of the criticism, at least around RCTs, especially in the medical arena, has been being where it's being tested and how it can be scaled up. So that issue of scaling up that policy tries to do. I mean, would you have any comment on that?
So normatively speaking, I think I would assume policies would always have unintended consequences. That would be my starting point. That's
Okay.
something that one of my professors also used to suggest we take as a given. I guess it's really a question of understanding what they might be, trying to anticipate them to the extent we can, and then seeing if there's anything that can be done to reduce them. In the worst case, if they are going to do more harm than good, then probably even realizing that do nothing is the best option as far as that particular problem is concerned. So even with control trials, I'm not suggesting that they would solve this problem. I guess it's really a question of using mixed approaches, and in our case, for example, possibly doing a bit more program evaluation, impact assessment, using that to inform our policy making, rather than saying that that will solve the problem and that's the route all of us need to take. So I guess that's where it goes back to the point on how we need to really practice this rather than assume that something is going to work and can be used indefinitely. So it would perhaps be useful to have short feedback loops where we can understand what's happening, what's going on the way we expected it to, and what's deviating from our expectations. Does that answer your question to some extent?
Yeah. Thanks.
Other questions? Preeti?
Hello?
Hey. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me? Yeah. So my question is about this feedback. So another example of unintended consequence that comes to mind is this in energy efficiency when the rebound effect of using older appliances which are inefficient along with the newer ones which are more efficient. So in that sense, there's a behavioral aspect of it. So what do you think of the feasibility of or the extent to which the behavioral aspect can be captured within like an evaluation of policy, since it involves a lot of primary data collection?
So I would really think that if it is going to influence the outcomes, then it has to be captured. It could be about capturing it through figuring out till where price elasticities are useful and beyond which point they aren't useful, figuring out other motivations that could influence people. For example, in Europe, it could be about human rights, or it could just be a concern for environment, whereas that might not work in the US. So it might be useful to understand what motivates people to behave in a certain way and how that can be used to promote pro-social behavior in a sense. Because ultimately, I would even look at economics as a science of behavior. And to me, your question is really about how do we move from pure price-based behavior to non-price behavior signals. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So at a national level, would it be feasible to do this, say, to have these attributes measured in the NSSO surveys, or do you have any thoughts on what kind of mechanism would enable this?
It would perhaps be, given our starting point, it might be easier to do it maybe at a city level, even figure out 3 or 4 distinct neighborhoods in Bangalore, understand to what extent prices could influence them to be more energy efficient, to what extent would the rebound effect undo the benefits gained from efficient appliances, and then perhaps scale it up if possible. But as Shweta was almost cautioning us, maybe beyond a certain point, it could be about figuring out what works in those spaces alone rather than trying to scale everything up through a big bang approach.
Right.
As an example, I'm not sure if capturing all of this data through NSS would be possible, what that would do in terms of unintended consequences for the survey costs, the time it takes to run them, the data you get, and so on.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else have questions? Meera. Meera, can you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So I didn't have another question. I just wanted to add on to the discussion of the energy efficient appliances. Regarding that situation of continuing to use the older inefficient appliances as opposed to a more energy efficient buy, it really would be a question of what economists call externality. I mean, my private cost of continuing to use an old equipment, if my O&M and maintenance cost is not, if it is high, then I will shelf that old product and buy a new product. So the cost that is accruing of continuing to use the energy or less energy efficient equipment is essentially public, and it's a negative externality, and my private cost would be high if I were to buy a new product instead of just continuing to use the whole thing. So like you said, probably, I mean, some of the options are having a penalty for using an equipment really old, or just being a positive fashion, like positive cycle, I mean, really strengthening that positive cycle of and creating awareness of how the payback is, creating that awareness that if you indeed invest in a new equipment now, over a certain time you will be able to pay back your running cost as opposed to the upfront cost. So, I mean, as long as I don't have an incentive really to negate those public costs of continuing to use inefficient, I would, under the no penalty situation, just continue to rely on old refrigerator or an old fridge.
Which makes sense, I guess. I think you're right in saying that individuals might not really care about externalities, and if we are analyzing or recommending policies, then it's our job to figure out how to make them care about it. And as you mentioned, it could be about using price signals to do that. It could just be about information to do that. One interesting thing about your comment, though, was in how we implement this, which is perhaps another area which requires more thinking, because unless a particular policy can be implemented well, it might not guarantee an outcome in the way it's anticipated, right? So, for example, can we say that we'll ban all inefficient appliances and be sure that that ban would be effective if people can actually still buy it off the black market or buy it illegally? Then it might work as a tax on other commodities. It might work as a subsidy on other commodities. One can't really be sure of what's happening till it's empirically understood.
Correct.
How
because
these instruments sort of...
Yeah. What I was saying is there will be very high transaction costs to implement that penalty in the case of appliances. But a similar thing has worked at least in Europe, in terms of discontinuing use of old vehicles, for example, through emission control norms. And if you have a penalty that, I mean, your 15-year-old model is just not allowed because it might be more profitable for you to just continue using that and not incur the cost of an additional new car, which is more efficient. But when the law stipulates that you can't drive it, and if there is a, which has still got an additional transaction cost, you have to check the certificate for emission norms, and someone has to check whether you are matching that and complying with that. But it has still been pulled off. But at the scale of appliances, that is that much more difficult to do.
Right, that's true. Which is perhaps where it's also a question of whether policies in one arena can really work in another arena without sufficient analysis of their implementability.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thanks, Meera. Does anyone else have questions? Maybe a last question, or should we end it here? Let's call it a day. I'm always around in office if you want to speak further. Thank you.
Thanks, Nihit.
Thanks, Meera.